Greetings, everyone. Hello, thank you for joining us. And I hope you're enjoying the online course so far. This is a video discussion, the first video discussion of this AuthorAID online course, Research Writing in the Social Sciences. So we found there's been really some fantastic discussion in the Q&A forums, but we also wanted you to see the faces of our team of guest facilitators as we put some additional questions to them. So we have a wealth of expertise here today in this video session. Many of the guest facilitators from the course are here. So perhaps if we do a very quick round robin of people introducing themselves, starting with Petra.
Hi, I'm Petra, and I'm here in fairly sunny Sussex by the sea.
Okay, Carol.
And should we say what we do, or it's just where we are?
Okay, if you say where you are and what you do.
All right. I'm Carol Sargent in Washington, D.C. I'm the director of a scholarly publishing office for faculty at Georgetown University.
Okay, thank you, Carol. And Phil?
So my name's Phil. I'm here in London, and I am a former academic geographer and the current managing editor for academic publications at the Royal Geographical Society in the UK.
Fantastic. Hasib, would you like to go next?
Hi, everybody. I'm Hasib. I'm based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I am associated with INASP as one of the associates. By profession, I'm an independent consultant. I work in the environment sector as well as climate change. And I have keen interest in research system. That actually has brought me collaborate with INASP. Thank you.
Thank you, Hasib. Ravi?
Hi everyone. My name is Ravi Murugesan. I live in Auroville, which is a town in South India. I work for INASP remotely from here. I'm mainly with this course in the technical queries forum, but I'm also familiar with the course content and happy to chip in when I can.
Thank you, Ravi. Have I missed any of the facilitators? No, I don't think so. Okay. So, and of course, I'm Andy, and I lead the AuthorAID project, and I'm a coordinator on this. So, what we're going to be looking at today, we're mostly going to be recapping on the topics of the first 3 weeks, which are embarking on a research project, research and publication ethics, and the evidence base for a paper. We probably have another video discussion coming up in a few weeks to cover what's in weeks 4, 5, and 6 on writing a research paper and publishing it in the journal. But for now, we're just focused on this first three weeks mostly. So for those participants that are joining us live, we're going to open up the floor for questions at the end of this discussion, probably in about 30 or 40 minutes. But for now, if you have any questions, if you could leave them in the chat window or raise your hand, and my colleague Josie will take your questions. So what we're going to do before then with the guest facilitators, we're going to run through a few questions that were some of those questions that have been asked on the course so far. I'm starting with some quite sort of basic fundamental questions and then bringing up some of the more complicated, detailed questions that you've been asking in the forums. So let's get started. So first of all, to the facilitators here, the first question is quite a basic one, but how would you define research and how does it differ from other evidence or writings? Would anyone like to start? Carol?
I think quite simply, it is the time when you make your contribution. And I always tell my faculty it should be excruciatingly small and completely tied to what has been known to move it incrementally into the future.
Okay. Thank you, Carol. Would anyone else like to provide a definition?
I can give it a go. sometimes the simplest question is hard to answer, isn't it?
Yeah.
I often I teach at one of the universities in Dhaka, and I teach research system, research methodology, and how to do it. And I talk with different kind of students. So I made a very simple, what do you call it, a statement, you may call it. I focus on creation of knowledge, but the creation of knowledge can be happening anyway. Now, if I just see outside my window, I will learn something new. So what's the difference? Research actually is a kind of an organized process. So you have to follow some standard procedure, which is respected, which is accepted by everybody. So you follow some standard procedure in an organized fashion and generate new knowledge. And the whole process is reproducible. If anyone wants to replicate it, they can do it. So this is the way I define research. It's a process of generating new knowledge. But I would like to echo what Carol has just said. We have to remember that we are part of a knowledge creation or knowledge creation legacy. Yes. We are not the first one.
Yes.
And I like Isaac Newton's the famous quote that whatever we have achieved, he achieved actually. It is by standing on the shoulder of giants.
Yes.
So we see what other people before us have done in a particular discipline, and we try to identify what are the knowledge gap, and not only the knowledge gap, what actually really matters. And we follow those steps, standardize one in an organized fashion, and try to understand which will be beneficial. And as a part of it, we become one of the giants. That's the fascinating thing of doing research. Standing on the shoulder of giant to become a giant. Yeah, that's how we define research.
Well, I like to chip in something briefly. Can you hear me?
Is that Ayo?
Yes, this is Ayo.
Hi, glad you can make it. You want to introduce yourself first?
Okay, I'm Ayo Ojebo. The second name is not easy. I'm the head department of communication and language arts in the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. I have also served as the coordinator of the postgraduate programs and research in the department for some time. It looks to me that the emphasis and the definition of research will vary a little bit from context to context. In Nigeria, where I work, and among my African colleagues, we always like to emphasize the process of joining a global conversation, because we always think it's important to let people realize that research is cumulative, so that you don't do your thinking and your writing in a context that is understood or that applies to that very small part of the world where you exist. So, and then it also helps us to emphasize the importance of very good literature review, because if you are joining a conversation, you've got to know the state of that conversation at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayo. Fantastic. So I think that kind of leads on to the very nicely to the next question, actually, which is another quite broad question. And that is, how do I frame my research in the context of the existing literature? So do you have any ideas on literature review and framing your research?
Yeah, we do it differently by discipline, because it is more typical in the sciences to say what was known before and then to define what you did, and then to say the here we show bit and show what you did. But in the humanities, you'll bury yourself. And so this is social sciences, which sits right between the two. And so in the humanities, you have to say what you believe first, or they'll assume that everything you think just came from someone else, and you have to have some original bit. So you start with you, and then you let them chime in. So if you have the humanities here at one end of a spectrum, and you have the hard sciences here at the other end, the social sciences sit right in the middle, are a little closer to the sciences. but you have to learn to frame yourself as a strong voice in this. I'll say more in writing, because I'm better in writing, especially at 6. But if you see these disciplines as a continuum, with the social sciences very ambiguously between the two, I think then you can learn a way to really frame yourself in a more scientific, but still with the voice of the humanities.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, Petra, you go first.
You should. Okay. I was just going to say, as everyone else has said already, embed it within the literature, and also very small, the questions. So when we're thinking about research questions, we often have very bold, big ideas, which is great, but you'll find it helps to kind of narrow that down to it's actually a very small thing you're asking. You can always expand it, but we often fall into trouble if we are over ambitious or our question is too broad that we don't quite know what we're doing. So it was just to echo, I think, what was said previously, keep it really small and simple.
I was just at a similar point in a way. I was going to add, when actually writing up some of this stuff, I think there's a tendency that people will write too much. They'll try and tell you too much. So actually, in terms of framing your research in the literature, you really need to say what we need to know, and only what we need to know. You don't need to tell us, you know, about the whole history of the field or about anything like that. Tell us what we need to know to understand why you're doing the research that you're doing and what it means.
Okay, great. Thank you, Phil. And that's related to one of the other questions we had actually, which was how specific or broad should I be when formulating my research question? And perhaps if we move to that one, and also on a related note, how many research questions / objectives should I have?
I think when we talk about number, you know, how many, when we try to quantify how big or small, it is all relative, isn't it? It's relative to, you know, which type of a study I'm doing. Is it a part of my master's research? I will be getting a degree, or it is PhD or MPhil, or I am a research associate in a particular institute. I have to do research as a part of my job description. So I would say that that's why we are having this type of conversation. Sometimes we can't learn things, that how many objectives, how many research questions, which research question is good or bad. You have to work with the experts or work with the supervisor. That's why we always have a supervisor to guide us, or a research guide. And we often, at the beginning of our career, we become part of a team. It is so important. I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't answer that how many objective or how many research questions. It depends upon the research you want to conduct, the research questions you would like to find answer to. And you have found that, yes, these research questions, the answer is so important, not for me as a researcher, but for the discipline or the society, greater society I live in. That will allow you to frame your research questions. But you have to remember that you work or you conduct a research within a time frame. You have a specific amount of resources. You have a particular things to achieve, a thesis to submit. All will guide you whether you will answer one research objective or 3 research questions. All depends upon so many factors, and we may learn it while doing it. Thank you.
And related to that was another broad question. Does anybody else have any tips or ideas on what makes a good research question? Carol, you had your hand up?
Yeah. I really like to let the field define the questions at first until I found my feet in the field. And even now, I look for unanswered questions that have been defined by scholars. They'll often say it is not known. They'll often say more research is needed. And I search for these words with an actual physical keyword search. And they pop right up. If you go into the problem is journal access, and we can talk about that later. And some will give you guest access if you get to know people in their field, so that I don't want to go down a rabbit hole. But in general, you can look for people who've recently defined unanswered questions to find a good place to start. I have many other thoughts, but that's one.
I think that's a really good idea, a really good tip. And I think the other place you can find, admittedly, as Carol said, with the limitations of access, is where you've got in research where people have described their study limitations. And it might be that there was something they wanted to do, but they ran out of time, or they didn't have, you know, the right facilities or whatever else. That might give you an idea of something you could then say, well, I'm interested in this, I'm going to carry that on. Maybe even talking to the researcher that's given you that idea first, but also it might help you understand that there was something that they did that didn't work, and you're also not going to repeat that. So it can be quite helpful to have ideas of things to try, but also a kind of aware that there might be a trap further down the line you don't want to fall into. So what you could avoid there as well.
I think both this question and the last question, I think what everyone said is really right. But the thing to remember as well is that obviously this is not just a straight line. You don't ask a question and move towards the answer. Often you end up going backwards and forwards a bit. So you might start with quite a broad question that you don't know the answer to. And then as you do your literature review, you will find that the answers are known, and then you'll refine your question and you'll keep kind of moving down. So that ultimately what you have is quite a small question that you might write up at the end in your dissertation or your research paper, but you might have started with quite a broad question. And I think it's important to remember that this isn't one process, it's the same process lots of times.
And that again, actually, I think it links on to the next question, actually, which was we've got many people that are starting this course from a very broad range of people at different stages of their career. Some of them have done their have a thesis or dissertation or report. They're sort of thinking, what's the fundamental difference between these things which I've got experience in writing and an academic paper that needs to be published in a journal, and what are the main differences that they need to be aware of?
Can I jump straight back in? Yeah. I think mostly actually it's style. So often the research will be done in very much the same way, but it's just the way in which it's written up. And it's very much not an easy question, because each journal will have a difference. So some will favor longer literature review, shorter methodology sections. Some will be other way around. Some will want lots of empirical details, some won't. So I think the key is to remember that actually the research process itself is pretty much always the same. There's very little difference. The difference is in how you are going to present that. And in order to do that, you need to know what journal you're going to present to, and you need to know what their style is. And you do that by looking at either the author guidelines on the journal website or webpage, or just by reading lots and lots of articles from that particular journal. Again, access, big question here, but that's the way to work out what kind of papers they're looking for, how they're set out, and then try and imitate that when you're writing up your own research.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Any other thoughts on the differences, fundamental differences between dissertation and academic paper? Haseeb?
Yes, Phil has rightly pointed out, we have to remember that we are writing something. Whenever we are writing something, it's a paper or academic journal paper or a report, it is a means of communicating our research. So that's the common thing, isn't it? We have done our research. Now we have produced a research report or a thesis or a dissertation, or we have written a manuscript which will be submitted to a particular journal. So we are communicating our research, but the media is different. Now the question is, when we will be, who are actually allowing us to communicate that particular research? If it is the university which has suggested us, hey, after completing your research, you have to write a thesis. So we have to follow the guideline of that particular faculty or department or the discipline, how to write that particular thesis. Often it depends upon the supervisor. He or she might have a different way of writing things. So you have to follow that guideline. Same things goes with the journal. There are numerous journals, thousands of journals, not only the index journal, but beyond that. All have different sorts of writing style. But the main thing is simple. You have to have a title. You have to give a summary or abstract, whatever you call it. You have to introduce your research. You have to introduce the methodology you follow. You have to introduce share the results. So the structure is same, but you have to remember the journal is space matters. But the thesis, it is you are conducting it. So everything could be quite detailed. But journal paper, they might put some embargo or put some word limit. The full paper can't be more than 7,000 words or something like that. So I echo with Phil that you have to follow the author guideline, author's instruction very carefully, very meticulously, so that you can write your manuscript in a proper way. That's the specialty or core difference between, I would say, thesis and academic writing for a journal.
So let's move on then, as we've had some really good responses so far, move on to some slightly different topics. So in week 2, we looked at research and publishing ethics. And we had many questions in that Q&A forum. One of them is, are there any ethical issues that we need to consider when we do data collection in social science? And then there are several different aspects of this, working with vulnerable groups, doing online surveys, and are there any particular issues that the researchers on this course need to consider?
Phil, you can go first. That's good.
No, you go.
No, you can go first this time. That's fine.
I was just going to say that there's lots and lots of things you need to consider. It's not an easy question at all, because it partly depends entirely on what you're doing, and partly will depend on why you're doing that and what you're trying to do with that, who you're working with, for instance. I think probably the main thing to really think about is consent, in terms of making sure that you're very, very clear. If you're working with people, which social scientists often tend to, that you're very, very clear about what it is you're trying to do, why, where the information they give you will be presented, how it will be presented, whether they will be identifiable or not, and all these questions. And there's no easy answer to that. They're always different. They're always the same questions, but there's always different answers to those questions whenever you ask, whatever your project is. I think the key is being clear and giving them a clear way to withdraw if they want to. That would be, if I was to pick one, that's what I'd pick. I'm sure others have others. But...
Again, to echo very much what Phil's just said. And I think with ethics, people tend to think about ethics as something to do with an ethics committee or an ethics review board. So you want to do a piece of research, and somewhere down the line you have to get some sort of an approval, and people don't tend to think about the ethics bit until they get to that point of asking for approval, whereas actually you need to be thinking about it right from the start. So the ethical issues to think about are about you as a researcher. Are there any needs you have about being looked after or being kept safe? And also about your own skills and your own abilities, the time frame that Haseeb mentioned earlier, that if you are not going to overstretch yourself, that you're not going to take on things that might cause harm to you or others. So that you start with you. And then as you're doing your literature search and you're thinking about your question, again, ethics is in the back of your mind. So who am I going to be studying? What am I going to be asking them to do? What have other people done before? How have they got ethics approval, and what has happened with them? When you're reading papers, we tend to read papers to see, do they help us stack up our argument, rather than what was the whole piece of research done there? So you can often spot when you read other people's papers that perhaps there were questions about ethics that you don't feel really were fully answered, or perhaps were explained very well. So again, look and see, did the paper make you feel reassured? Imagine actually you were not a researcher, but a participant. Would that research have actually made you feel safe and included? And was it a consensual process or not? And then when you're thinking about your own research, building in piloting, building in checking, building in testing, talking to people who are going to be like the participants in your study or communities you'll be working with, and making sure that you are the right person to be asking the questions, that the questions that you want to ask are appropriate. If they've been answered before, Do you need to ask them again? If you are going to answer them, how are you going to ask them in ways that don't put your participants not just in a stressful or dangerous situation or an uncomfortable situation, but do you include them? Do you make your research accessible? Do you inconvenience them? That's come up a lot in the conversations we've been having about participants are expected to kind of get to you as a researcher, but maybe they're having to pay transport costs to do that. How are you even thinking about budgeting in your research so that people aren't inconvenienced in any way? So there's lots and lots of ethical questions actually that you would be asking all the way along, and having a thought about them then helps you put together your ethics application. Bearing in mind that this isn't like a rubber stamp that once you've got that you are a good researcher and free to go. It's just a step in the proceeding along with your supervisor or your research team or other bodies you're working with of oversight that you'll know the work's being done, but ultimately it's you, the researcher, who's the person who's got to be the ethical one. So you can have ethical approval and still do unethical research. It's just a case of thinking all the way through. So I guess it's an encouragement to see it as it's a thread that runs through everything. It's not just something you drop in here and there.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Carol, you have to say
Well, this goes back to a trick that I do all the time, and I've really encouraged young scholars to do it again and again. And that is to piggyback on what's already been done, but maybe not in your country or context. So if you find a very fine study, but it was only done with, you know, white Americans or Pakistani people from England or whatever, you know, you have these really different populations, and you say, but this could be possibly replicated in my country or not, or I think my country would be an exception. They've already passed a lot of the hurdles that you would need to pass, and so what you could really do is just frame it up. I always talk to the scholar first. I don't steal other people's research, but I do the more elegant version of stealing, which is to team up with them and to ask them if they would mentor. And then, of course, sometimes they'll even co-author, and then you could simply extend the study to your country. Often you'll find that it doesn't work in a different context. I've rarely found something that works for one group and just works beautifully for another. Sometimes. We have a woman doing that now. She lives in Korea, and she is looking at single parenting there, but it's really different in her country than it is in a lot of the contexts of the literature that she's working with. So she, by definition, has all these new questions to ask simply because she lives in Korea. And, you know, she's highly supported by the scholars who did the research because they can't go to Korea. They don't have the funding and they don't have the cultural context. So she becomes an essential correspondent for their thing. And when I was listening to Petra really give that great list of all these ethical things to think about, well, good, they've already thought about them. And some big universities already signed off. So it doesn't mean you can just go then. You still have to get a sign off. But I think a university would feel much more comfortable signing off if they knew that the highly recognized university of such and such had already been okay with this. I don't know. So that's one too, where the shoulders of giants. Who said that? Was that Hasib? Yeah, thank you. Because it's don't let go to waste the incredible strength of these people. They often want to partner with you because it makes them more global, and frankly, you're free for them. They otherwise would have to go to your country and figure out what's going on. And now you're just standing there saying, hello, I live here. I speak the language. I have a PhD. What's not to love? You know, I know someone will team with you. It might not be the first person you ask, but I know someone will team with you, because who could resist?
Okay, great. Thank you, Carol. On a related that you mentioned there about being unable to travel. So obviously this is a problem that the vast majority of us currently have. Now, I wanted to ask, do you have any tips on doing research remotely, and or are there any different ethical implications about doing interviews or research remotely, say via Skype or email, or any differences between doing an online survey rather than a face-to-face interview? Do you have any tips on that, or is there any different thinking behind the ethics of these approaches?
Yeah, I think I haven't really seen it on this course, and I think it's because there's been a lot more thoughtfulness. It's been really good to see about people asking really smart questions on it. I have seen predominantly from UK and American universities a misinformation that if you put a survey online, somehow or other that stops it requiring ethical approval. And I think that came originally when people very first started putting surveys online, that the online sphere was unusual and perhaps people thought it was a fad and ethics committees weren't very familiar with it. And so I think they didn't see it as requiring the same oversight that now we realise it does. So there are still issues about recruitment, who's going to be in your research and how you're going to find them. If you're doing any kind of research in a face-to-face way, where there's a dialogue, and that could still be actually over the phone. It doesn't have to be immediately looking at somebody. It could be on the phone or on Skype or like we're doing here. You can have a conversation. So I can see everybody here, and if I wanted to chat to them, or if I sensed through body language, they wanted to talk to me or I'd said something wrong, we could have a dialogue. Obviously with an online survey or an online tool where people are just filling it out remotely, you don't have that. So when you are asking them sensitive things, particularly, or confusing things or complicated things, you have to make it really clear. You have to have signposting to support. You will need ethics approval. And it's not as simple as thinking, well, I've got a paper survey, I'm just going to stick it online and it will work the same way. It won't. It will need testing. It will need piloting. It may not work as effectively. I'm seeing a lot, again, predominantly from American, Australian and UK universities and some Nordic universities saying, well, we're just going to put all our research online and it will be fine. It probably won't be, because online research is a different kind of discipline. There are different methodological approaches. There are different theoretical and philosophical underpinnings. So you need to go and learn that first, rather than, again, it's our standing on shoulders of giants. You don't just put it all onto a different format. But also think about the needs of participants. Not everybody's got online access, not everybody's got the bandwidth, not everyone's got the time. There's time zone differences. My kids so far haven't walked in, but they might. I might not want my family hearing things. I might want to be talking about things privately. I might not feel safe. So there's lots and lots of issues that we should normally think about around safety, well-being, understanding, consent and competency, but they are kind of different and in some ways much greater online. So I think if you want to do online work, that's fine, but you need to understand online research first and then proceed. Slowing everyone down again, sorry.
Thanks, Pesha. Always slowing people down with the ethics. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to move on because we've got lots of questions in the chat. And talking about research ethics, it'd be difficult to go through a discussion on research ethics without talking about publishing ethics, in particular plagiarism. And so, as any general tips, do you have any techniques that you can recommend to avoid unintentional plagiarism for the researchers on the course? Any avoiding plagiarism tips?
I have a very simple one, which is if you ever copy anything into your manuscripts, copy it in a different color. I put mine in red, and then make sure you don't turn it black until you've changed the words. And this is the people do this, they forget that they've copied something, and so suddenly they've forgotten what they wrote and what they didn't, because that's how it is sometimes. So just be really careful in copying things in, making sure you know they're copied, and that you change them or attribute them properly before you submit anything. I think how you're, again, it's that author guidelines thing. I've looked very carefully at how your journal wants things presented, because again, the most of the plagiarism that I see in my role is actually just accidental. It's people not quite doing it the right way, which then looks like plagiarism, but when you look, it's not. They're just meant to do something else. So just be really careful.
Any other general advice, Carol?
Very quickly, I have noticed that the concept of plagiarism differs by country, culture, and context. Assume that if you're from an underrepresented country in the literature, assume that the definition of plagiarism is much, much stricter than you were taught, because I just find a lot of confusion from my global scholars, and I don't believe it's ambiguity on the ethics. I think it's just a genuinely different concept of what collaborative work entails. And so get clear on it first. Don't assume that you know where the line is. You know, unless you are from the very same country that the journal is published in.
Okay, thank you very much. So, any other thoughts on avoiding plagiarism, or should we move on to some other questions? So, okay, I'm going to go on to some other questions that have been asked. One of them was in the forums a few days ago, a very specific question. So I'm hoping that somebody's going to have an idea of how to answer this, because I'm not entirely sure how to. Can you explain the difference between a theoretical framework and a conceptual framework?
I'll go straight ahead. I think there probably are very technical differences. In most, I think most of the time they are talking about the same thing. I think there is a very technical difference between a theory and a concept, which you could get into, but I think largely they're serving the same purpose. That would be my interpretation of what the difference was. Mostly there isn't one.
Okay, great, thank you. Did Hasib have his hand up there? Yeah, go ahead.
I often explain it to my student in that way, that theoretical framework is not not a specific situation. You are generalizing things, and when you have a conceptual framework, often it is for a particular situation when you are working on it. You are bringing together the idea, the concepts from literature review to bring everything together. So the conceptual framework is for your particular research, but when you translate the theoretical framework, which is kind of a general thing, once you make the theoretical framework, which is an established one, you just picked it and translated it into for your situation, it becomes a conceptual framework. So in that way, you can see that the theoretical framework and conceptual framework, they're kind of connected. But in a general thing, that theoretical framework is a kind of, I wouldn't say established, it is kind of established because lots of research actually put into to develop a theoretical framework. You can build your research upon a theoretical framework, but if you want to put elements in it to explain the situation you will be focusing on in a particular research, you are actually converting it into a conceptual framework. But once the research is done and similar concept is used for other research, altogether, all those conceptual framework at the end, along the time, will create a new theoretical framework. This is the way I see theoretical and conceptual.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. I was going to say, maybe there will be some variation in the way these differences between conceptual framework and theoretical framework are conceived across some disciplines. I'll use the example of media studies, for instance. If I'm interested in studying the effect or the impact of particular media on particular behavior, my concept would be, I mean, if I'm asking, for instance, my concept will hover around the issues or questions or definitions of impact, and the definition of, if I'm going across social demographic variables, these specifications of these variables. So a key concept, for instance, that I want to define will be the question of impact and what makes up an impact. But that I am going to define from literature, and I think the there will be more than one concept. So the networking or the perceived interaction of these different concepts form what the theoretical framework for my work is. Now, in media studies, there is a huge body of theories of media effect. And I'm likely going to anchor my research on one of these, you know, the one that I think best frames whose propositions frames the investigation, best frames the investigation that I'm trying to carry out. So my theoretical framework is going to be around the theory that frames my work. The conceptual framework will be the specific concepts that I am trying to interrogate. Of course, there is a very important connection between the two, because today's literature more or less becomes tomorrow's theory, and today's concepts are driven from today's literature. So there is a connection between them, but then there is a thin line that separates them, in my view.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Aya. So another very specific question that I saw, with regards to something mentioned on the course, mixed methods. Can somebody explain the difference between mixed methods and triangulation? Yeah, go on, Patrick.
Phil, I'm going to be a not so brave and let Phil try it first.
Well, so I haven't done qualitative research for a long time, so I can't remember the exact details. I think there was a question I saw today, which was about the difference between mixed methods and multi-methods. And I think there's a technical difference there, that mixed methods are ones that use both qualitative and quantitative research methods, whereas multi-methods just use more than one kind of method. So it might be two qualitative methods, it might be two quantitative methods. I think that's the difference in a technical term. I may be wrong, but that's the way I've understood the difference. Triangulation then can come from either. So triangulation is just about, it's actually a term that I think comes from GIS, so from satellites, where you use 3 different satellites to exactly pinpoint where you are in the Earth. So it's about using lots of different methods to check that the answers you're getting from one method make sense in lots of different ways. So it might be that people who are being interviewed give you the sense of one thing, but actually when you survey them, it's something different. So that's how you start to triangulate, or the census data might be different to what people think. Yeah. And as soon as all of your methods line up, that's when you know you're at roughly the right answer.
Thank you, Phil. Pat, did you want to add to that?
Just to extend it really, because I think Phil explained it really well. Something I have seen is that when you do research and you send it out for review, or perhaps when you're applying for a PhD or you're looking for funding, people will say, if you're proposing a predominantly qualitative piece of work, you must do triangulation because you need to have some kind of quantified work within that. And I suspect sometimes triangulation isn't properly understood. I think Phil explained it really well, in that if you want to be sure of an answer, you might use a couple of other sources. So you might use a survey and a focus group and perhaps an audit of some kind, or some other way of working to try and show what you're finding is fair and accurate. But I think sometimes if people aren't sure about a particular method, they'll ask you to triangulate it, because what they're really saying is, we don't trust what you found with this method. So if you use this usually more quantified method, it therefore becomes more accurate and true. And I'm quite cautious about that, because I think it doesn't necessarily explain it. And sometimes you can point to other areas instead of having to go through a very laborious task of doing lots and lots of different checking. So you might do a focus group, but you know from the literature review that we've already talked about and how important that is already informing a great deal of your thinking, and you're going to try and do something else that just takes the literature a bit further forward. Because I have heard of people getting really into tricky situations of taking on much more research than they can, or being told that what they've done is limited and they must triangulate, I think it's fair to say, actually, I have done this piece of work, or I'm proposing this piece of work, and I'm going to do that here. And if other people would like to triangulate it, or if I want to take it further in the future, then I will. But I might not necessarily do that now, or it may not even be needed. So I think it's just about, it's not to say don't bother, it's about, it's a tool. So is it the most appropriate tool to explain what's going on?
Fantastic, thank you very much. I think we're going to open up the floor to questions now. We've got about, well, we've got around 10 minutes left, I think. It's about 50 minutes since we started. And I've got at least 4 questions as they come up in the chat, but I thought I'd give anybody who's on the call the opportunity to actually, if they can unmute themselves, ask their question out loud if they want to. Anybody? Okay, don't worry. I shall ask the questions that have come up so far in the chat on your behalf. So unfortunately, you're going to have to listen to my voice again. So the first question we had, which is much earlier on, was how do you decide on authorship for an article? So how do you decide who's first author, second author? If several people have participated at different instances in different capacities, and there are different versions of the same manuscript, how do you decide on the authorship? Any thoughts on that? It's again quite a big, broad, controversial question. And I can imagine it differs in different disciplines, but yeah, go Petra.
Okay, I'll have a go. So ideally, it's a bit like the thing I was saying with ethics previously. It's that all of these things really need sort of establishing fairly early on. So if you are the person, primarily the first author is the person that does the majority of the work. So they come up with the idea, they've perhaps obtained funding, they've completed the most of the research. However, it can vary. So for example, I might come up with the idea and I might obtain the funding, but I might not collect the data. I might hire somebody to do that work for me. Now they should still be an author if they've contributed significantly, but they wouldn't necessarily be the first author. They might feel like the first author because they've been out there every day collecting all the data, but it was my idea and I have the overall oversight of the research. So sometimes it's not clear and sometimes it is. I think we have already got it shared, but I will put later on. There are various organisations like COPE, and I think the medical, one of the medical journals have got very specific guidance of who has done what. So you can go to that and say, I've done this job, therefore my authorship should be included. There's often a bit of debate around who goes first or last, and that again we've heard previously about author and journal styles. So in some journals it's really important that you're first author, that's the prestigious slot. In some journals, being the last author is the prestigious slot. So it really can depend on who goes where. The thing that I'm really worried about, and perhaps other people could join in talking about, is we see quite often that a student has come up with the idea, had funding for PhDs or perhaps self-funded their PhDs, collected all their PhD data, and they've had supervision, but at the end of it, when they go to submit the research, the supervisor puts their name on first. And that, I think, undermines all the work that the student has done. And there's particular inequalities if the student is from a low-income country, but their supervisor is not, or competition where supervisors are under pressure to boost their career and they're trying to take it ahead. Sometimes that's explained as when you become the supervisor, you get to do this, but I don't think it's very healthy. Equally, what do you do if you're in that situation? You know, you're very junior, your supervisor is more powerful, there's all sorts of problems going on there. So I don't want to suggest it's an easy thing to say, well, let's just talk about it and it will all be resolved. But I think you can bring in the ethics here, that if you've done the bulk of the work and you've borne the responsibilities, then you have earned the first author slot. And again, that's where those guidelines support what you do. But I don't know if other people have got things they want to share about the nuances and complexities of it, because it isn't easy.
This is difficult when there's a power differential, like Petra just mentioned, but we do try to get it in writing first. In an actual document, it's a co-author agreement. And I have a model it came from the book publishing world. Co-authoring is harder than single authoring, but it's often necessary. And the problem is when you're a student who's relatively powerless, someone could either refuse to sign such a document or engage in it, or, you know, wave it away with the just trust me, or, and I don't always think that they're being nefarious. I think that they genuinely believe that they're more important, and you know what I mean? They're not trying to be evil, they're just being stupid. And I try not to attribute to evil what could be racked up to stupid. And so I would say that that works about 50% of the time. It works beautifully among colleagues and equals, though. So whenever you're co-authoring with colleagues and equals, don't just say what order our names are going to go in, but try to define by percentage and by task and by hourly contribution, if you can, what's going to go into this. It can be revised, but it's easy to have a good, clear sense. And also what to do if someone doesn't respond. You can say, if after, and I always put time is our friend. If after 3 months we do not have your contribution, we reserve the option to either cut you from the team with thanks and the acknowledgements, or ask that you renegotiate this document or something like that. And it's weird. People really do tend to honor these things a bit more when they're written down. Again, though, going back to Petra's thing, the power differential is just huge. And I don't know what to say except understand that when you're working with someone powerful, they can be greedy and think they're entitled.
Great, great reply. Thank you, Carol. Yeah, what was the name of the book? Was it a book you mentioned, or book chapter? The guidelines, yeah.
Writing your journal article in 12 weeks.
How to write a journal article in 12 weeks.
You want to reach out to Wendy Belcher. She's a full professor at Princeton, and she wrote it. And she grew up in Ethiopia, actually. And it's interesting because she's white and I think American. She might be English, but I think she's American. I'm not sure. But because I haven't talked to her, I've just emailed with her. But she grew up in Ethiopia. And so she has the languages and the culture in a lot of very interesting ways. And so she's an Africanist, and she just has this really interesting global perspective. And she created the book to empower global scholars. The problem is the publisher put a ridiculously high price on it, but she herself has the right to grant people a PDF copy. So, and she's extremely approachable, and her whole raison d'etre is global scholars. So go for it.
Great, okay, we'll have to find out, follow up and find out more about that.
She should be one of your stars.
So, Ravi, did you say something?
Yeah, very quickly. I can remember that in the last year when we had this training session MOOC, one question came up, like how to deal with head of the department, because without doing anything they become author. So I wrote an answer. I'd like to share that. If someone you are bound to make author, give them some task to do. That will at least qualify their intellectual contribution. You will not feel like you are just gifting them without any without exchange of anything. So it is one way. We understand that particularly in the global south, it happens really, really often. We must appreciate that because it is reality. But we have to discuss it more often. Sometimes that creates the awareness. There is no way, since I was a victim, when I will grow up, I become big, I will do the same thing. No, we have to keep the discussion going that it is bad, unethical, but we should also involve the people to do something like designing, commenting on the design, commenting on the whatever the comment is, so that it is not just free lunch. The authorship doesn't become a free lunch. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Haseeb. Ravi, were you going to say something?
Yeah, just to add something quickly to what Carol said, this book is something we used for the content development of our course back 6 years back, 6 or 7. I actually purchased the book and sent it off to our primary content writer in Sri Lanka. And then later it went through some stages of revision. But this is a professor in Sri Lanka who contributed some of the initial content. And he's referred to the book. I've seen at least one reference in somewhere in the course resources. Can't say, well, I know it. I've seen it. I've held the book. It is big and it's really good. I didn't read it. I'm not a social scientist myself, but I would. Yeah, I think it's the only book of its kind and the best one. But it's quite a tome. You know, it has a lot of. But I didn't know. It's really good to know that she would might be be able to give free access to it, but it's an expensive one. And anyway, so something maybe for INASP to follow up on. Thanks, Carol.
Okay, we will. Yeah, we will. Okay, fantastic. I've got 3 questions that are outstanding that I'm going to try to squeeze in if possible. So maybe a kind of a quick fire round, even though these are really complicated questions. So the first one is to do with publishing conference proceedings as journal articles. This is one that's come up in a few of our discussions before, but maybe it's worth mentioning again. Somebody asked, what is the procedure as regards publishing extended abstracts from conference proceedings as journal articles? Is that possible? What kind of potential problems might there be? Phil?
I'll jump in. I'll do it quite quickly if I may. It's check the author guidelines. My favorite, seems to be my catchphrase today, but some journals let you, some don't. Usually you'll have to expand a little to fit the journal style. That's generally not a problem. To tie back to something else we talked about before, they will flag up on plagiarism check. Usually again, not a problem, but so it's worth just flagging to the journal if you're submitting it that it is a conference proceedings before and it might overlap. Our journals accept them, so yeah, not usually a problem. Just be open and clear about what you're doing. Okay. And that might change actually if the proceedings are published or if they're just put online. If they're already published in a volume, you might not be able to. It should say in the journal guidelines. So.
Okay, so check the journal guidelines, which is the answer to a lot of questions, I think, on the course.
Oh,
Carol.
I have a secret about checking journal guidelines because sometimes they're good about writing it on the website and sometimes they're not. But the board is wonderful. Most of the board have published, I mean, almost by definition, the board have published for the journal. And they also don't get as many questions as the editor-in-chief. And so reaching out to the board can be fantastic. What I do, because not all of them are willing to talk, is I BCC all of them. And ask the question and see who answers. And usually, I'd say about 80% of the time, their email addresses are right there, but they're usually easy to find.
So email the entire editorial board.
I've done it.
Yep.
I figure, hey, I didn't threaten their children. I sent them an email.
Yeah, why not?
I actually. Yeah, it's easy to answer usually, and people are very happy to answer these sorts of questions. But do always email your journal if you want to ask questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good tip. Oh, Petra.
I've just got one other quick tip, which a boss gave to me a long time ago. So for some conference proceedings that are published, they're almost a paper. For others, they're just a very small abstract. As we've already heard, if it's almost a paper, you bring it into line with the journal guidance. So we'll leave that there. If you are submitting a very small abstract, and then in a few months' time you're going to go and give a paper, the tip that my old boss gave me was, if you haven't written your paper yet, start drafting your paper in between the time you get your abstract accepted and you go and present your talk at whatever conference it is. Because it's very tempting, I think, to have got an idea, put in an abstract, you're still working on that idea, you haven't written anything up, be that a PhD chapter or a paper or whatever, you go and do the conference, have a lovely time, and then you forget it, and it just disappears. And so what their advice was, that you have a kind of a draft paper that either you put an abstract in for, or if you haven't yet, you work on that draft paper, you give your conference presentation, and then you refine that work with the feedback you get from the conference or the ideas that come to you while you're at the conference, and then you submit it quite soon afterwards. So it stops you, I think, having the joy of lots of conference experiences, but not necessarily taking that work forward any further.
Okay, fantastic. Good response. Okay, thank you. Two incredibly quick ethics questions to end with. So, specific questions we've had in the chat. One of them is, to what extent, when developing research and doing the field work, data collection, does the researcher have to explain to the informants or participants about the ethical approval of the research?
Well, I saw that question. And I think it should be right from the start. I mean, people need to know just as much as exists about the research. That is the whole idea of transparency. Then they can make their informed decision. Thanks.
Okay, great. Right from the very start. Any additional comments on that? No, okay.
Same answer, as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Not always possible right at the start, but yeah, as soon as possible would be mine.
As soon as possible. Okay, that's quite clear guidance. And finally, on ethics and review boards, are there levels of ethical requirements, especially studies not involving blood or vulnerable populations? Are there things like soft ethical approvals? Petra, you got your hand up.
Yes, it depends on the board. And you will still need to put in for an application, but there are different kind of ways that they can do stuff. So they can fast track. So if we take, for example, the moment with coronavirus, lots of people are wanting to do research. So they're looking at ethics committees at the moment, I think, are exhausted, but they're also looking at whether this work should even go ahead, because a lot of it shouldn't, and whether or not it can be given a fast track approval. Because if something's happening that's very contemporary or timely, you haven't got time to wait till the board sits, so they can have a special sitting where they can review it quickly. You can also have something called chair's action. So the chair of the ethics committee might have research that has either already been done and just wants a small amendment, or that it's a piece of research that they can see is fairly uncomplicated, doesn't really need the whole board to look at it, doesn't really need to go through it, so that can be signed off on chair's action. But equally, if you make significant changes, you might have to go back again. The question in all this is that you don't make that choice. You can look on their website, you can find out from them what's going on, and as we heard from Carol earlier with the board of editors, same with the ethics committee, email them and ask. I said earlier, they're not like there to sit there and rubber stamp your research. It's a dialogue and a conversation, and they are a resource. So you can actually ask them what kind of ethics approval you should be seeking and when are the deadlines. Whatever they ask you to do, give them that stuff. Don't assume that you can kind of cut corners or proceed without them. And I think finally, don't assume that research, that you can decide what's sensitive or not. You know, there are some projects that are clearly more risky, more dangerous, contain within them more invasive procedures, but people can become upset or troubled by any kind of study. So, you know, you have to be thinking about that all the way through.
Okay, thank you, that's great. One final question, which I've seen that we haven't answered. Well, just to say, there are some questions about the ranking of journals, and I think that's quite a big, that'll take quite a long time to explain that. And I think we're going to have to save that to the next discussion and the lessons coming over the coming weeks. There's one final question, and that was, it was pointed out in one of the lessons of the course that qualitative methods cannot be used for generalization. Can this statement be explained further? So qualitative methods cannot be used for generalization.
I suspect it's, I mean, I'm not convinced that's entirely true, but I suspect it alludes to the fact that qualitative methods generally use smaller sample sizes for the very practical fact that they're more intensive to do. They take longer. It takes longer to interview someone than to put a survey up online or to read through some census data. So generally they have smaller sample sizes and are less broad in their kind of information they gather. They're usually much deeper which just makes it more difficult to say for sure that that's generalizable, you know, with any sense of statistical proof. It's just, that's the reason. There's usually smaller sample sizes, I'd guess. I think obviously if you ask everyone qualitative questions, you could generalize pretty well. It would just take forever.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I think we've come to the end of this session. We've kind of slightly gone over time, but that's fine. So this this discussion is being recorded, and we'll share it later on the course. We may break the discussion into smaller chunks for people to watch videos about particular topics. But for now, thank you very much, everyone, for coming along and being part of this. Particularly, thank you to the facilitators who have answered my trickily worded questions, let's say. And thank you very much. And we'll see you again on the course in the coming weeks. And have a great day.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much for having us. Bye.
Bye.